that to some extent, the drug users of today were like the Jews or the witches or the gays or any other despised and oppressed minority. I think that was the other element in which my kind of consciousness, kind of crossed over and where I found a calling in this drug issue.
Welcome to the Set and Setting podcast with Madison Margolin. As a journalist, Madison has spent years exploring the intersection of psychedelics, cannabis, and culture. This podcast brings together thought leaders from today's psychedelic renaissance to talk about the role of psychedelics in our inner and outer lives. You can support this podcast and find additional resources at BeHereNowNetwork.com/Madison.
Hey, Ethan. Thanks for coming on to the podcast.
Hey, my pleasure, Madison.
So this is the new season of Set and Setting, and today we have Ethan Nadelmann, who is the founder of the Drug Policy Alliance, known as DPA, and he's played a leading role in drug policy reform efforts for the past several decades. He has a law degree and PhD from Harvard and currently also hosts a podcast called PSYCHOACTIVE, and is really someone who I've known about for years, decades myself, as one of the pioneers in drug policy reform, and also just he's a friend of, or the father of someone I'm friends with here in New York. And so I really see him both as a teacher and also as a dad and a policy guy and all of that. So thank you so much for coming on to the show.
Oh, no, it's cool. I appreciate Madison, all our connections. Plus, I know your dad a little bit. I know your sister a little bit because your dad's been a prominent cannabis attorney and your sister's in that world as well. So it's very nice connecting with you in New York.
Yeah, it's funny. I reconnected with Ethan's daughter probably 7 years ago at this point at a backyard party in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, and we realized we'd met each other when we were very young, probably as kids, probably also through the some normal party or whatever. Yeah. Normal is the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, for those who don't know. But it's small world.
Mm-hmm. It definitely is.
So, I've interviewed you a small handful of times, and, a big thing in this podcast is looking at how people's spiritual lives and spiritual backgrounds influence the work that they, are out doing in the world. So where does your impulse for drug policy reform kind of come from? And does that have any sort of spiritual backing to it?
Well, I'll tell you, Madison, I mean, I sort of, have reflected on this over the years, kind of self-analyzing myself. How did it come out this way? And I think, one part of it, I think, was, of course, growing up. My dad was a rabbi, ordained as a conservative rabbi and a leader of the Reconstructionist movement. And then my mom had grown up in a sort of modern Orthodox background. But I grew up Shabbos, suburban, Shomer Shabbos, and all of that. And fairly, moral. I think among my friends and my kids, I was a fairly ethical kid. I didn't engage in most low-level criminality that lots of teenage boys do. But then, I go off to college at McGill in Montreal, where I started. And I remember getting high for the first time and enjoying it and thinking, like, why is this illegal? And there was something about thinking these laws have something fundamentally wrong with them. And then like a year later, sophomore, I write a 50-page paper about John Stuart Mill's treatise on liberty, the famous statement of liberty that he wrote in, I think, 1859, where he distinguishes between self-regarding acts and other regarding acts, and what's the proper role of government in dealing with that. So there was that kind of political consciousness that emerged early that I think had something to do with my upbringing. And then I think some years later, I realized this sort of in retrospect, that I needed my intellectual pursuits to be connected to something that I was emotionally inspired by as well. And in my early years in college and the beginning of graduate school, I'd focused on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East and, written my master's thesis and my undergraduate thesis and taken my courses. And I even taught the first course at Harvard back in the early 1980s on Israel and the Palestinians. But I found myself burning out on that issue and feeling kind of depressed about it all. And a friend of mine who had said, Ethan, you've always been interested in drugs and crime and deviant behavior. why not do something about that? So I started pursuing that. And I realized that part of what engaged me was that I had this personal hook to it. That even though I, as a young white man, was unlikely to be arrested, I still had to live with the fear of that doing so, and with the fact that I could be called a criminal and all of this sort of stuff. And so that notion of my intellectual pursuit, my intellectual interest in drugs and drug policy being connected to a personal identification, I think that was a significant part of it as well. And then I guess the last piece of it was, I grew up with a very strong sense of Jewish history. And I was curious about Jewish history, but also my father had been born in Berlin. He and his family fled from Berlin in 1939 when he was 11 years old. My father's father had, won the Iron Cross for Germany in the First World War, and then been killed in Auschwitz, during the Second World War. And so I was very aware of this history of people, both individuals and a larger group, being demonized, not because of harms they were doing to others, but simply because of a majority feeling that there was something fundamentally immoral or evil about this group, that they needed to either be eradicated or transformed. And to some extent, I really saw what was happening to people who use drugs in the United States and around the world in something of a similar light, right? That people were being demonized, not for doing, and criminalized and stigmatized, not for what the harms they were doing to other people. They were being stigmatized solely because of the substance that they put in their body or had in their own possession. And that resonance, that to some extent, the drug users of today were like the Jews or the witches or the gays or any other despised and oppressed minority. I think that was the other element in which my kind of consciousness, kind of crossed over, and where I found a calling in this drug issue.
Right. I mean, there is something to be said. And I think maybe it was you or Rick Doblin in an interview many years ago where I was looking into why so many drug policy activists are coming from Jewish backgrounds. And someone said that the same way Jews have been a scapegoat for so many ills of society, drugs and drug users are also kind of used in that same way, whether, even if it doesn't really have any bearing on the realities of how these systems work.
I mean, Madison, there was a book called Ceremonial Chemistry by Thomas Sass, the famous anti-psychiatry psychiatrist. He was most famous for writing the book, The Myth of Mental Illness. But his book, Ceremonial Chemistry, even though it got some things radically wrong, the bigger thrust of it, because the subtitle of it was the ritual persecution of drug users, witches, and, some other, I can't remember what the other ones were, gypsies, whatever. So it was about looking at drug users as kind of, especially in the late 20th century, as other forms of overt discrimination, based upon race, gender, sexual identity, as those were being increasingly delegitimized, at least in proper kind of company and in public spaces. The demonization, the stigmatization, the way you could say anything and support any types of penalties on people simply because of what they put in their body. I think that notion that this was the next civil rights struggle and the next civil liberties struggle that was going to be pivotal, and somehow getting involved by happenstance on the ground floor of that.
And was there anything, about the experience of getting high, so to speak, that really, I mean, there was obviously a passion there that made you passionate about this issue. So, what was it like the first time you did get high, or that cannabis became part of your life, so much so that, you began to identify with the drug policy as a,
I don't know if it was cannabis, has been a friend of mine, since I was 18 years old, and it still plays an important role in my life. And I would say it's been an enormous net benefit in my life. I mean, I can remember a few of the downs, but overwhelmingly it's been positive. But I don't think it was the one that was spiritually significant. I mean, really, in a way, it was really mushrooms, which plays a bigger role in that regard. And that among all the psychedelics, mushrooms has been my real go-to one, the one I return to, the one that I'm most familiar with, and where I've had extraordinary experiences. I mean, typically the experience happens not as you're kind of climbing to the peak of the experience or when you're peaking. It's really in that beautiful period where sort of the parachute opens up and you've peaked. You're no longer feeling the drug come in your body and you're floating down. And it's in that period of time where I've had, incredible insights that, intellectual insights. I've had experiences, culinary experiences, sexual experiences, but also realizations about my own life. And in fact, even back in 1989, I'd sort of become a semi-public figure. In 1988, when I'd had kind of a couple of bouts of 15 minutes of fame as a young professor at Princeton, out there debating the issue of drugs and becoming prominently identified with drug legalization, which was defined in fairly crude terms back in those days, at least by our opponents. But it was about a year and a half later, in the fall of '89, and doing mushrooms. I remember in Telluride at the tail end of Andy Weil's and Our Good Times Telluride Mushroom Conference. And really, it wasn't an epiphany. It was more a sort of concretization that my life was going to be about drugs, about psychoactive drugs, and that it didn't matter. I assume they'll edit out those costs and all that. That it didn't matter whether I stayed in academia or whether I got into politics or journalism or advocacy or whatever, but that my mission in life, really, my calling in life was to really teach about drugs, everything about drugs, history and politics and policy and the ethics of it, and that in itself would be something of a vehicle for addressing broader issues in our society as well.
So, the way that drug policy or drug policy reform has really taken shape, at least in America, and I've seen it sort of bifurcate into two paths, right? Like you have the medicalization movement, medical marijuana. Now we're seeing psilocybin, MDMA, whatever, going through FDA-approved trials to be used in assisted psychotherapy. And then there's the more decrim, grassroots, like movement that is, about, in cannabis, you would call it adult use or recreational, but that isn't rooted in the medicalization per se. Maybe it's backed up by the studies and, what people are hearing about through the benefits of these substances, but that's not the thrust necessarily of decrim all the time. But what I'm also noticing is a third path, which gets less attention, which is the spiritual sacramental use of altered, mind-altering substances. And so my question for you is, being in drug policy all these years, what do you make of sort of looking at this bifurcation with this kind of third option as well, when people talk about using drugs in a legally safe way, so to speak?
Yeah. Well, I think, Madison, it's important to tease out the differences between marijuana and psychedelics, first off, because in a way, medical marijuana, with both psychedelics and even more so with marijuana, the medical background, the medical legitimacy, the medical value of these products goes way back, right? Cannabis was in the pharmacopoeia until it was prohibited at the federal level in the 1930s. There's extensive historical and archaeological evidence, whatever the medicinal use. So that was there. But keep in mind that when we started pursuing, the medical marijuana had a kind of opening phase with Bob Randall, who was the real pioneer back in the 70s and 80s, and then Dennis Barone and folks in California in the early 90s. But when I've been involved in the late 80s, early 90s, but when I put together the funding and the campaign, Dennis Barone and his allies had drafted a ballot initiative in California in 1995, but had no ability to do anything with it. It would have just been a dead letter, sort of. And I was able to put together the campaign and the funding, but when we were doing it, it's not as if we were pushing for pushing for medical studies on medical marijuana was part of our agenda, but it was a minor issue. It was the fact that huge numbers of Americans already understood that marijuana had medical value. That was just a reality. And it turned out that in fact, over 30 states, I think, in the 70s and 80s had passed these little medical marijuana research program laws. So it was already part of the public consciousness. And so in a way, our focus on medical marijuana wasn't about getting the FDA to approve marijuana in whole form for medicinal stuff the way it is with the psychedelics today. It was much more a kind of vehicle for opening up a broader dialogue around how society should treat marijuana, right? Now, we also had a moral element to this, which was that if anybody had a right to be first in line, to be have their marijuana use be decriminalized, it was people who were really using it for medical purposes. So there was that moral aspect to saying the patients get to go first. But there was that other aspect that the public would go for legalizing marijuana for medical purposes, but not do it more broadly. 55, 60% back then were supporting it for medical marijuana, only 30% for broader legalization. So for us, it really was much more integrated with the broader decrim effort. And there was relatively little tension between the medical marijuana side of things and the broader marijuana legalization elements. I mean, there were some medical marijuana purists who say, don't conflate this with broader legalization. And there were some people advocating for legalization who were worried that we would be peeling off the most sympathetic victims of the war on marijuana by legalizing it for medical marijuana patients, and thereby slowing the ultimate attainment of the objective legalization. But now the thing with psychedelics is different in the sense that there are these two tracks. And I have to say, I've been a bit mystified by the way in which some people who are pushing very hard for the decriminalization of psychedelics, especially the plant medicine forms of psychedelics, feel some level of hostility toward the whole medical side. And I think that's basically a mistake, because all of what's happened on the medical side with what Rick Doblin and MAPS are doing, and and with what Michael Pollan's book and the other stuff, essentially, not only is that going to open up avenues for the FDA to approve this and for health insurance to cover it and all this sort of stuff, but beyond that, it's destigmatizing these substances. It means that people are going to be less likely to be persecuted and stigmatized and criminalized for using marijuana outside medical channels. It's going to potentially open up all sorts of diversions into these channels. So I see these things as really much more holistic. And I think that some of the criticism, for example, that the Colorado initiative, psychedelics legalization initiative this past November took from some of the folks who were pushing for, a more radical decrim model, I think it was, I don't know, I still don't quite get it. I still think it was mostly counterproductive, and that there's a much more, if in fact you start to see some of the people on the medical side push for, tougher penalties on people growing them, making their own mushrooms, that would be a real issue. And we saw a little bit of that with some of the medical marijuana folks. When GW Pharmaceutical, the first company to get FDA approval for a medical marijuana substance, and then they start lobbying against marijuana legalization. So there is a little risk there. Now, on the last part of your question about the spiritual side, for me, look, many people regard cannabis as a spiritual thing and use it in that way. And depending upon how broadly you want to define spirituality, I guess I could include it that way. I know that there were people who made this effort in the courts going back to the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s to assert a First Amendment religious right to use cannabis, and every one of them got shot down. And so whereas I think when the psychedelics started moving forward, first with the Supreme Court case involving the UDV and the use of ayahuasca in the UDV ceremonies, I think they were very carefully doing a very narrowly tailored approach to doing that slowly could broaden out to Santo Daime and others. So I think that, the value of psychedelics, not cannabis, but psychedelics and the spiritual side, is not just has a richer history to it, but there's all this evidence behind it as well. Not to mention, the study that Roland Griffith and Bob Jesse did early on about the spiritual benefits of psychedelics. With cannabis, you can make that case, and I think there's books on cannabis and spirituality. I just don't think it's as powerful a case for as many people.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Like the official precedent in the use of established religions is not there the same way ayahuasca might be with, Santo Daime or, whatever churches we're talking about. Yeah, I'll respond to one thing before I go on to the next question I have is, with regard to the sort of more hardcore decriminalization activists pushing back on these medicalization, these only medicalization arguments, I think a lot of the fear is that legalization for some can cause like a sense of recriminalization in some ways. And so when you have
what's the basis of them? What's the evidence to support that claim?
I'm not saying there is necessarily, but it's like when, I guess to an extent in cannabis, right? Or maybe like, I guess what I'm okay. So the fear is that if you're in an overly regulated paradigm, then the people who are continuing to do it underground or who don't want to play along with the regulations put forth by, the powers that be are then still at risk of
But you
criminal
see, as
sanction.
far as I can see, is their situation doesn't change. I mean, right now, people are getting their mushrooms, whatever, they're getting the ayahuasca, whatever. Why will that change at all if the government approves people being in, working with a physician and getting it from a legal source? I mean, I don't see how it sets it back unless some of those players start to push for crackdowns on people doing that sort of stuff. Remember, look, in the case of marijuana, where people are paying big licensing fees, and you now have a whole legal marijuana industry emerging and people getting into it, including people who were on the illegal side, and they're saying we're paying a lot of money, we're paying taxes, we're obeying regulations, so you got to crack down on all these people selling it illegally, and that's a reasonable argument to make. I think it's less likely to see that happening in the psychedelics area. And meanwhile, one in the whole marijuana legalization effort, I've always been very, very, strong on the notion that you have to have the right to people to grow their own as well. Because anybody who wants to opt out of the capitalist system or the whole regulatory system, as long as you have the right to grow your own, well, I mean, that is a good opt-out. And the fact of the matter is that for people who want to use mushrooms, I haven't done it, but my understanding is it's not that difficult to make psilocybin mushrooms, at home yourself. So as long as that stuff remains decriminalized or legalized, and I think it's more likely for it to remain or become decriminalized or legalized if the medical side is proceeding apace. Right? I mean, because people are learning there's much less to fear than we realize. So, it's one thing to say, well, the activists have that argument, but if it's an evidence-free argument, then that's a bit fucked up. I mean, evidence-free arguments, I mean, give me a break already. I mean, there's a lot of, if they want to show a real evidence-based argument, I'd be curious to see it, and it might change the way I think about that. But I haven't seen that yet.
What I have been seeing actually recently in New York is, there obviously are a lot of these kind of like CBD consumption lounges, cannabis places, and all of these spots are also selling psilocybin products, DMT vape cartridges, whatever, behind, like in the back room, so to speak, of a lot of these places. And I know recently there have been a lot of crackdowns in the city, I think in the past like couple months. So that's something is, we're in now a quote unquote like legal cannabis paradigm here in New York. However, the places that are, trying to like go, take advantage of that atmosphere and then kind of push the envelope a little bit further are now getting busted, I think.
Yeah, but you see, once again, I would challenge that as well, because what's happened is, because of New York City's history with very high levels of racially biased marijuana arrests, nobody had a real appetite to be busting people for weed, right? With Eric Adams, the police department, nobody really wanted to go that way. And people took advantage and said, okay, we're just going to all start selling it. We're not going to wait for the regulations. And, New York State has a slower rollout than many other states because they're trying to get the whole racial social equity thing right. So, New Jersey, Connecticut are opening up quickly, and New York's taking it very, very slowly, and the argument is, and there's some real merit for this, that we want to get this equity piece. So I think what you'll see is more and more crackdown on cannabis shops that are not basically, playing by the rules. And I think that's reasonable because the people who are playing by the rules are making an investment in doing so. Now, to the extent that the whole, psychedelics thing is piggybacking that, I'm not so worried about it. I think that stuff's going to find its own channels. I mean, the fact that they exist in this illegal thing where hundreds of shops around the corner from our apartments are selling this sort of stuff, I mean, that's nice. But so what? I mean, the hell with it. I mean, this stuff is going to move forward, and, they're piggybacking cannabis legalization or the gray market right now. I don't think they get any great big moral claim out of being involved in that stuff. The other thing, to the extent that what they're selling are products like vape cartridges and a range of other things, there are issues around safety involving this stuff. I mean, we saw what happened a few years ago with what was called E-Valley. It all got, with people were vaping and landing up in hospitals, and 50 or 60 people died, right? And people blamed it on nicotine, nicotine e-cigarettes, but in fact it was either 95 or 100% involving, some knuckleheads who were producing THC cartridges, with a vitamin E acetate in it that was safe to drink, but very dangerous if you heated it. right? So I think we need to be careful on the safety level when people are beginning to manufacture products. That there's a reason we have the FDA. The FDA may be screwed up in all sorts of ways, but when I buy different products, I kind of like to know, what they are, that there's some oversight. I mean, I've gotten to my age smoking, illicit marijuana for, 45 years or whatever without any apparent harm. But if I was vulnerable, if I had some, immune system issues or other things, and especially if you're taking out of vape cartridges or other types of things, it's nice to have that ability to have this stuff regulated. And the
Yeah.
people who are playing by the rules, should not be ruthlessly undercut by people who don't want to play by the rules when the opportunity to play by the rules has emerged. It ain't perfect. And I always would say that, one of my great regrets in playing a leading role in legalizing marijuana was I knew that what we were doing was going to land up putting out of business people who've been growing this stuff for decades, sometimes multi-generation families, the people who've been supplying me with weed for, one way or another for many decades. So I knew that was a cost of what we were doing. But to my mind, the upside was that we were going to, 700,000 people a year were getting busted for marijuana possession. And we were going to drive that name down. Hundreds of thousands of legal jobs were going to be created, right? People were going to stop getting hurt and killed in disputes over this sort of stuff. I mean, so there was so much upside to legalization that even if the ultimate model of legalization was one that I didn't like, one where big business plays an ever bigger role, it was still going to be preferable to a system where, large numbers of people are getting busted and all sorts of harms are resulting.
So, one of the effects of legalization, and this is something my dad dealt with a lot, is when California legalized cannabis, there wasn't, some people who lived in rented apartments, for example, weren't even allowed to smoke on their properties because of landlord issues and stuff like that. And, they're unlike for alcohol, there aren't bars necessarily or sometimes now there's consumption lounges, but before that was kind of a new idea. And so I think it was like 6-7 years ago when this was being debated. My dad actually went to Ram Dass and he said, I want to now start arguing for, public consumption or safe consumption lounges or something like that. What do you make of this? Like, how can I argue this? You're just kind of asking for advice. And Ram Dass said something like, tell them, I guess the authorities or whoever, tell them that cannabis is a path to God. And so the same way there are spiritual, homes of spirituality and shoals and whatever, that cannabis should, be seen like that. And so the places where people can come together and smoke should be regarded similarly. And so my question is, from a policy perspective, what do you make of that argument? And this is not necessarily creating a weed church, but, cannabis as a path to God, like how does that hold up? Or anything really, it doesn't have to be just cannabis.
I mean, what I would say about that, Madison, is that, first of all, if you look at the evolution, when we were first trying to get the first legalizations, whether it was the medical marijuana back in 96, 7, and 8, or the first broader adult use legalizations in 2012, 13, and 14, these laws had to be drafted very tightly. We wanted, for example, to prohibit, drug testing people for whether they smoked a joint over the weekend when they were not at work. We wanted to expunge all prior convictions. We wanted to, mandate home grow everywhere we did it if possible, right? But what you realize is that each of these things decrease the likelihood of ultimately winning. So the initial initiatives were drafted very tightly, but it just makes sense that as people become more and more comfortable with this, now you can expand outward. So the notion of having consumption rooms, the notion of having very expansive expungement, the notion of putting in there social and racial equity, preferences and opportunities for people who've been harmed by the drug war. All of these things would not have been winnable in the first generation of these things, but are now, really much more doable. The fact that New York State, I'm very proud of my successors Drug Policy Alliance because they really led that legalization of marijuana in New York, first with medical, but then after I had left with broader legalization. But New York became the first state where you could smoke marijuana anywhere you can smoke a cigarette. Now, when it comes to the issue about people being criminalized for using it at home, or at least being punished, in fact, we got involved in that issue firstly on the issue around people smoking cigarettes or vaping in public housing. Because if you were poor or living in public housing, you couldn't do it outside, and then you couldn't do it inside either. So it was basically a kind of catch-22 that was really tripping people up. Now, the argument for consumption lounges, I don't think it really needs the religious argument. I mean, I love Ram Dass, and he has played an important role in my life as well. But I think you don't need it for the consumption lounge. I think the fact that this is a way for people to relax and enjoy themselves. Something like a cigar bar on the one hand, something like a coffee shop, something like a place where you go to have a drink, and in fact that it is in many respects less dangerous, right, for your health than a cigar bar, and also less dangerous more broadly than alcohol. So I don't think we need the religious argument. I'll be curious to see that there's some rabbi in Colorado now trying to make a religious argument on marijuana, and there's a range of other people trying to do that. Maybe they'll get some traction over time. I mean, look, the Rastafarians, I think there were a couple of cases. There was a case in Guam, the U.S. territory. There was a case in South Africa. They didn't succeed in the U.S. cases. In Jamaica, the religious right is used. So there are recognized religious uses of cannabis. I think that for modern day Americans to make that claim, I think if they can, want to try to do at this point, it's not really necessary since it's going to be more broadly legal anyway. That's I think generally my sense about that.
So switching gears a little bit, you mentioned that, Ram Dass has played a role in your life. You've met him here and there. What have your experiences been with him? Any cool stories
I'll tell you,
share?
I really got involved in this issue in the late 80s when I was speaking and writing. I was teaching at Princeton back then, and I've been kind of involved on the sort of beginnings of what was then called the Drug Policy Foundation, which eventually became part of Drug Policy Alliance. And then I got the call out of the blue from George Soros, the billionaire who was not quite famous back in 92. And we shook hands on an agreement that resulted in my leaving Princeton. And so I was asking people, here and there about, how should I think about this? And 2 or 3 people said, go talk to Ram Dass. And I heard him speak once at the International Transpersonal Psychology Conference in Prague in June 92. First time I heard him speak, and the one and only time I heard Terence McKenna speak. And so this is like a year or two later, I go to see Ram Dass and tell him about my situation, and I say, have any advice for me? And he says 2 things which really stuck with me, and I've shared them on occasion. The first one was, he said, you need to learn to love William Bennett. Now, that name's not so familiar to people anymore, but William Bennett was the first drug czar. The first official head of the Office of National Drug Control Policy in the first George Bush administration back in 1989. And he really was a profoundly, I think he's still alive, an evil person. A person who was really saw the drug issue as the way in which to advance a reactionary right-wing agenda and had people who are otherwise politically centrist and middle class embrace it by playing on their fears around kids and race. So, really just a hateful, just horrible, pushing for the death penalty for all sorts of drug offenses, and just, horrible. And Ram Dass says to me, you need to learn to love William Bennett, right? And I knew what he meant. And the way I interpreted it was, if we actually ultimately want to be successful in making our minority view a majoritarian view, it meant that ultimately I was going to need to be able to find common ground and to reach the hearts and those, maybe not the William Bennetts who were so invested ideologically and ego-wise in their cause, but the people who were drawn to them, right? That one had to have a welcoming, open message that was going to reassure parents and others that what we were arguing for was the better, right? And then the second thing he said to me, the second one was, he said, you need to let go of your attachment to the things you're fighting for. And what I took that to mean was, win or lose, this is a just struggle. And so even if I land up retiring without having succeeded in legalizing marijuana or turning around the broader drug war or reducing incarceration, it still would have been a life well lived. It still would have been a cause well pursued because the struggle has its own justice. Now, I'm fortunate because by the time I stepped down running Drug Policy Alliance, 6 years ago or whatever, in fact, we had kind of crossed over where marijuana legalization was inevitable. Harm reduction was becoming more and more the norm, although there's still a long way to go. And our efforts to reduce the role of the drug war and mass incarceration were finding more and more success, where the number of people locked up on drug charges, apart from marijuana, has dropped dramatically. But even apart from that, it meant that even if this had been a futile effort, it would have been worth it. So in that sense, Ramdas was valuable. But then, Madison, I may have shared this story with you before. There was a key moment. And I had him, he joined my advisory board of Drug Policy Alliance. And I remember when I would go out in San Francisco and speak, and he would actually come and hear me speak, which I really appreciated. He got a real kick out of that. And I got a kick out of having him in the audience and seeing him beaming and, while I was doing my thing. But then he reciprocated. In 2001, he invited me. This was a few years after he had his stroke. And he reciprocated by inviting me to be part of his group of Ram Dass and Friends. This was an annual event he did at the Omega Institute in, an hour or two north of New York City. For people who don't know, kind of the East Coast Essel, right? And he invited me to be one of the teachers. So I show up there. And interestingly enough, it's 2 weeks after 9/11. They'd gone forward keeping it, right? And I show up, there, and there's Ram Dass, and there's Krishna Das, and there's Lama Surya Das. And I realized I'm going to get to be Ethan Das for a week. I'm one of the teachers. So I did my thing, and I hung out with these guys. And then the funny thing was, the second they were there, I'm kind of ragging on all of them because Yom Kippur is in the middle of the week. Right. And like at least half the audience there must be, lapsed Jews. Right. And what do Ram Dass and Krishna Das and Lama Surya Das all have in common? They all were bar mitzvah. They all did psychedelics. They all went to India, to find their guru. They all came back to America to become prominent spiritual teachers who had an ambivalent relationship with their Judaism. And so I'm teasing them, and I'd actually brought a High Holidays prayer book with me, and they're kind of a little sheepish about it and trying to jab back. Anyway, Wednesday, I finished my teaching, and Ram Dass sends his aides to call me in. He calls me, and this is when he was smoking weed 24/7, sticks a big fat joint in my mouth, gets me high as a kite. And he said, I want you to lead Kol Nidre, Yom Kippur, Erev Yom Kippur services tonight, right? Because that was the night. What do you mean lead services? He goes, you can do it. Your father's a rabbi. You know this stuff. You're giving us shit about this. You can do it. And so I said, okay. And that night, thank God I brought a prayer book with me, but we get up for, the evening gathering of the 150 people or whatever were there. And I, together with Ram Dass and Lama Surya Das and Mickey Lemley, who's a documentary maker who had done a documentary about Ram Dass, we're all Jewish, and I led a Kol Nidre service, very makeshift, very haphazard. But it was really, it was an incredibly meaningful experience. I mean, I literally come down when it's over, and Krishna Das says, Ethan, from now on, you're my rabbi. And then there's some other woman who's from Martha's Vineyard. Ethan, you have to apply to be the rabbi in Martha's Vineyard. We have an opening there, But it was so incredibly fulfilling. And I actually saw it in a way as Ram Dass kind of encouraging me to kind of spread beyond. The drug issue is a huge multidimensional issue, but I think it was his way of pushing me to expand my reach, my horizons, my thinking, my grasp, which I probably never did as much as he would have liked. But, And then the funny thing was, Madison, my daughter and I were vacationing in Maui right before the pandemic, and I sent him a note to get together. I didn't hear from him. And then I find out he had died like the day we arrived or the day after. And so Lila and I, my daughter and I, got to go to a kind of Hindu Shiva, and basically sit alone with his body and spirit, in Maui, at the place where he'd lived in his last years, which was a kind of, coming full circle and very meaningful.
That's really special. I remember that was the first night of Hanukkah that he left his body, which is how they say
right.
it.
Yeah.
It's
right.
funny. What you said Ram Dass was on your advisory board?
Yeah.
What motivated Ram Dass to be part of a drug policy advisory board?
I asked him. I mean, we had a mutual respect. And, also I got a kick out of having an honorary board that had Walter Cronkite, and, the famous newscaster, George Shultz, the former Republican Secretary of Everything, Frank Carlucci, the former head of the CIA, the former head of the National Institute of Drug Abuse, the former police chiefs and mayors, and Ram Dass, right? It just kind of added that. And, there were some strategy meetings that we used to do in Santa Barbara. A friend of mine, Chuck Blitz, he and I would co-organize these drug policy strategy retreats in Santa Barbara in the late 90s. And I would invite the key players from drug policy reform. Chuck invited some of the key political players he knew, but Ram Dass would come to these as well. And his presence was always incredibly appreciated there.
Wow.
So, yeah.
I mean, Ram Dass is really a product of the drug war himself. I mean, and what I mean by that is if the drug war hadn't launched, around when he was getting kicked out of Harvard and going to India, I do really feel like the way it kind of blew up in his face, you could say, kind of got him onto the next path of his life. And I wonder if there hadn't been a backlash to the work that he was doing, if he would have even ended up as Ram Dass.
Well, I mean, that's right. I mean, in a way, his hooking up with Timothy Leary. By the way, there's a great novel, T.C. Boyle, who's a famous American novelist, and he wrote a book called Budding Prospects about growing marijuana in Humboldt or Mendocino He wrote this book back in the 80s that I really enjoyed a lot. But he more recently wrote a book a few years ago about the kind of early years of Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, which is Ram Dass's name beforehand, from like 62 to 64. It's a novel, but based upon a lot of historical facts. And I think, Ram Dass's journey, I mean, who knows if Harvard, I mean, the combination of, they were doing things they shouldn't have done as professors. They were getting beyond the scientific study, and they were beginning to enter a kind of guru-ish mode. And I'll also say this about Ram Dass, without in any way being criticized, but it's more of a compliment than anything else. But I know 3 people who were close with Ram Dass over many decades. And I remember all 3 of them saying in one way or another, I've never seen a transformation in somebody from being such a royal asshole to being such an incredible, menschy spiritual leader. But I think Richard Alpert back in the 60s, he was not, I think, the most admirable human being in some other ways. I think his journey really brought him to some beautiful places.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. It's funny because, as a kid, I thought of Ram Dass, he's a family friend. I thought of him as, one of these spiritual guys, and I didn't, one of the Hindus who'd be around for kirtan or whatever. And I didn't think about him as a, psychologist or a professor or, an academic. And so it's kind of coming around full circle. I'm writing a book right now on the intersection of Judaism and psychedelics and, my perspective on that coming from a household where Ram Dass was a, very common name. He'd come over. And now the folks at the Be Here Now Network also recently sent me this new book that had never been published before. It's LSD, A Journey into the Asked, the Answered, and the Unknown, which was authored by Richard Alpert and a few other guys, Sidney Cohen and Lawrence Schiller. And it's just so gratifying and fun and cool to read Ram Dass as, kind of as the drug expert, the LSD expert that he is. So, especially that this copy of this book has come out now rather than 60 years ago, I think is really brings it back around where we can re-look at Ram Dass's psychedelic legacy from the perspective of where the psychedelics are now.
Well, ultimately, I think it's also, this is my own bias, but if you think about it, a number of the people who became leaders, right? There were the people who stayed in academia, not just psychedelics, but drug policy more broadly, like Lester Grinspoon. You take Arnold Trebeck, who co-founded the Drug Policy Foundation back in 87, 88. He was a professor at American University who had written a very scholarly book about, the British approach to heroin. Andy Weil did not become an academic, but, he got a medical degree and he published leading articles in Science magazine early on. I was very much shaped by my background in academia. Rick Doblin, leading MAPS, went to the Kennedy School and got a PhD. And I think that there was a real benefit to our having this kind of, and then, obviously Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, right? And some of the others in the psychedelics field, you can look at Dennis McKenna today with a PhD and a range of others. Um, Coming from an academic discipline and with some of the expectations of rigorous thinking and analysis and the importance of parsing through evidence and understanding that, what a causal relationship is and things like this, I think it really made our movement and various elements are that much better grounded, that much more sturdy. And I think it's important that as the movement goes to the next levels, and as you see fewer academics in leadership positions and more kind of activists coming up, it's going to be important to retain that element of academic and sort of scientific rigor in our thinking, because like when Roland Griffiths, or even in the early days back in the 60s when Leary and Alpert and Metzner and a range of others were publishing these articles, they were publishing in scientific journals. When Roland Griffiths did it, he was obviously a distinguished scientist, and publishing a piece on spirituality in a leading medical or scientific publication, that stuff's important. So I hope I think it will continue to be the case. And, before I left Drug Policy Alliance, we created an office on academic engagement, which back then and is still headed by Jules Netherland, together with Sheila Vicaria. And so it's really important to keep that connection between the academically rigorous, world and the rigorous way of thinking and the advocacy.
Yeah, I mean, I think, that's something that I always questioned was, coming from a Jewish tradition, which is also a very academic tradition, and it's by the book and whatever, and then growing up seeing all these Jews, like my dad, like Ram Dass, whatever, kind of doing Hinduism, Hindus, so to speak. And I said, but like, what do you know about Hinduism? Like, what do you're like, what are you reading the Gita? I mean, some of them are, Ram Dass definitely.
Mm-hmm.
But it was sort of this dissonance that I experienced and that I'm writing about now, which is that, my parents were putting me through Hebrew school and I was getting bat mitzvah and had this academic Jewish approach that wasn't really practiced at home, because at home we had this more folk blend of, Jewish culture and Hindu song and, those traditions. And, I think there's a certain rigor that is necessary, whether it's through talking about drugs or talking about religion or whatever the practice is, that you kind of understand the roots of it and the rules of it, not because you have to follow those rules, but I think it gives more freedom and more depth to, any practice or discourse.
Yeah, no,
or
it's
discipline.
true. Although what I would say and challenge you a bit on this is I think that even the way you and most Jews are, and even me for that matter, brought up, a lot of it's not really academic or discipline in that respect. We're learning about Jewish culture. We're learning the language. We're learning the Hebrew. We're learning, many of us learn how to read Hebrew without really understanding what we're really saying in the prayers. It was more about identity. And for so many Jews, a lot of it's about whether it was the relation to the Holocaust or to Israel or to food or to the holidays. And in a way, so for people to embrace some of, Hindu or Buddhist or whatever, I think many of them began to embrace it, not unlike they embraced through Judaism. I mean, it was like being an immigrant to a new religion or something that was not necessarily fully in conflict. It's why you could have Hindus and Bujus, right? That you could integrate those things. I think the analogy with Judaism would be either those people who become immersed in study of Talmud or Bible, or those people who get immersed in sort of the academic study of Judaism as a civilization. Look at Jewish history, and for example, and do it in a rigorous way. And I think that for many people embracing, obviously people go to varying depths to the extent, or look at people now who are not Jewish getting interested in Kabbalah, right? I mean, you can go surface, you can go deep, you can go deep, 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 and people are looking for certain things. And sometimes you can become pop Kabbalah or pop Hindu or pop Jew or whatever, and it kind of makes it a little bit of a mockery of it. But on the other hand, there's also something sweet about it to the extent it's not getting too grossly distorted, and as long as it's grounded in basically positive values.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think, whatever it is that gets a person to feel like their soul is being nourished, I don't think it matters which discipline or religion or path it's coming from. And so that was my next question is, I always ask people who I see are doing such valuable work in the world is, what nourishes you that enables you to go forward and do this work? So do you personally have a spiritual practice or meditation practice or mindfulness or whatever it is, like what helps you kind of like be the fullest version of Ethan to then serve?
Well, I mean, I'd say, I mean, now I'm kind of been semi-retired. I stopped running Drug Policy Alliance 5 years ago. I've done the podcast and I do a few things here and there. Um, but I mean, I cannot say that Judaism, I mean, my Jewish identity plays a big role, and the only thing I retain from having been Shomer Shabbos, Sabbath observant and fairly religiously observant when I was younger, is I still keep kosher. I mean, I'll eat out in regular restaurants, but I won't eat any meat or shellfish or anything like that. I'm basically a pescatarian when I'm out and about and what have you. And that's a kind of, people ask me why I still do it. And I say, well, it's 1/3 religious identity, reminding myself of my Jewish connection, every day. It's 1/3 family loyalty because it was part of what my family did, and at least one of my siblings still does. But it's also 1/3 superstition. Like I've led this incredibly lucky or blessed life. And maybe, just maybe, the reason my life's been so fortunate, so blessed, is because my keeping kosher is part of the cosmic bargain with God or the higher power, or the spirit, or whatever. And who knows? I better not stop doing it because I can't believe how lucky I've been or how blessed I've been. So I think, there's that's one element like it. I think the second part is, there's a second element, which is I always really believed in the Menschkeit rule. Like one rule I had for people joining my board, and I was very open about it, was nobody gets to join this board unless they're a mensch. I don't want people on the board for the wrong reason. I didn't put people on the board because of their money. I didn't put people, or the connections. They had to meet, apart from being committed to the agenda, they had to be a mensch, and also in the workplace, that there was an expectation of Menschkeit, of behavior. And if you couldn't stand up to that, the vast majority of the time, I didn't really want you in the organization. And that's a spiritual thing. I don't know, but it definitely made Drug Policy Alliance a place where many hundreds of people were happy to work at, and where people look back on it fondly, and where there's a whole kind of, DPA alumni community that feels very good overwhelmingly about the experience that was there. In terms of my own personal self-care, I mean, I'll tell you the thing that's been most valuable for me for many years now is once a week when I'm home in New York, which I am most of the time, I take a 10 milligram edible, grab my headphones, and I go down to the corner for a long multi-hour massage where I put on my music. The marijuana comes on and I just float and have this famous masseuse for many years who just works deeply into my body, pushes me to my pain threshold, and my brain just gets to float. And it's the closest thing I have to, I think, a regular meditation,
Wow.
which I hope I'll just keep doing for the rest of my life because it's, and interesting, I haven't had to raise the dose. The 10 milligrams just keeps working for me now for years. So, yeah.
Wow, that's a great practice.
Yeah, it is. It is.
So one last question I have is, you've been around drug policy for a while now, and I'm curious how the ethos of the activism has changed over the decades. Does it seem like the motivations or the values or the demographics who are involved now are different than 60s or 70s, 80s, or,
Yeah, I mean, the 60s was before that period of the 60s and 70s, like when Normal got started, so that was before my time. But when I got going as an activist, I started studying the drug issue back around 83, and I got going as an activist around 87 or so. But I mean, how's it different? I mean, obviously, it's become a huge movement. I mean, not huge in the way the environmental movement or reproductive rights or civil rights and Black Lives Matter is, but much. I mean, in terms of what it was a few years ago, or a few decades ago, it's really growing dramatically. That's first. Secondly, in terms of who's involved, I mean, as we said earlier on, there were a disproportionate number of Jews involved in the early years, just because Jews tend to be early on most social justice movements. We tend to play leadership roles. And fortunately, it has expanded. I mean, you see fewer Jews involved in it now proportionally, but the fact that you have a significant growth of of especially Black and brown. I mean, it was enormously frustrating in the early years that no matter how hard we tried, young people with ideals, who were young Black, young African American, they weren't really drawn to this, right? And even criminal justice was seen as a little bit, off on the side. It was like, I don't know, whatever it was. But that's really changed very substantially. I mean, to me, it was one of the things that I really liked about Black Lives Matter was that it was the first manifestation of the civil rights movement that really embraced broader drug policy reform. And in fact, DPA and Black Lives Matter did a joint, I think it was in 2017, either 15 or 17, we did a joint, a thing where we kind of merged our events for like an evening or a day. And it was, I think, one of the first times that any sort of, kind of diverse social movement had done this in that way. And so I think in that sense, it was that's been a very positive evolution. Sometimes what I feel a little sad about is that, part of the cost of growth, like in the mid 90s, I would organize these events, as I said, with my friend Chuck Blitz in Santa Barbara, and we'd have the head of NORML there, the head of Marijuana Policy Project, we'd have Rick Dalman from MAPS, we'd have the head of Families Against Mandatory Minimums, we'd have the head of Ira Glass from the ACLU, we would have, key leaders, and all of us could be in one room. We all shared a fairly common set of values. And we can embrace the broader principle. But now the cost of growth is that this marijuana thing is massive now, and elements of them, A, don't even know where the movement came from, and B, feel no connection to the broader movement. And the psychedelics thing is becoming so huge that people can say, what do we have to do with harm reduction or racial justice or mass incarceration, right? And then even in the mass incarceration thing, they can kind of go, oh, what do the psychedelics have to do with us? Or what does marijuana have to do with us? Or, if it doesn't have a racial equity piece to it. So it's the kind of loss of that kind of communal sense of identity and consciousness. Now, the flip side to that is that some of the underlying principle, the core principle of drug policy reform is, to my mind and many other leaders, that nobody deserves to be punished or discriminated against or amongst for what we put in our bodies, absent harm to others. Right, that core principle of non-discrimination and not punishing people because of what we put in our bodies. Very similar, by the way, to the core principle underlying gay rights, right? And so I think that principle, I was worried, the fact of the matter is it does continue to get out there in good ways. People care about it. Drug Policy Alliance is still very committed to that principle. And one of the roles I find myself playing now is when I go and speak at psychedelics gatherings, basically, my role is to speak about the connection of psychedelics reform to the broader drug policy reform movement and the importance of identifying and sharing with it. To say, so when it comes to psychedelic exceptionalism, yes, sure, I am a psychedelic exceptionalist. I am a marijuana psychedelic exceptionalist because those are the drugs that have been the best for me in my life. They have the best benefit cost ratio. And I think more broadly, that's true. That being said, the core principle that nobody should be punished for what we put in our bodies, absent harm to others, applies not just to the elevated substances like psychedelics or cannabis, but even to the less elevated ones, the opioids and the stimulants and all those sorts of things. So that's my role there. And meanwhile, going and speaking drug policy reform gatherings and saying, don't ignore psychedelics because if it doesn't have a big racial justice piece to it, don't ignore these other elements, that this is all part of a piece. It's all about advancing broader notions of freedom and justice and compassion and human rights through different avenues. And they're all connected by the fact that each of the substances we care about were and oftentimes still are criminalized, and people are still being punished for using them or growing them or selling them or buying them. So I think that's that evolution's happening. I will say I'm overwhelmingly happy with the way that the movement has evolved. I think that, to see, Cassandra Frederic, who heads Drug Policy Alliance now, she came to work for me when she was like 23 out of college, barely knowing, should she take this job or go work for the drug czar's office? And now she's a dynamic, incredible leader of Drug Policy Alliance. And if you look at some of the other organizations, you see a similar sort of evolution where the kind of, pioneering white men like myself have stepped aside and are now being succeeded by women and people of color in a way that I think is very positive. I mean, I think it's also equally important that all these organizations, not refrain from hiring young white men, because right now, I think for a lot of young white men who want to get involved, there's almost a do not apply sign hanging out of many social justice organizations around America. And I think that's not only unfair, and unreasonable and sort of reproducing some of the discriminations that existed before is actually going to be counterproductive. It's important to keep open arms for young white men in social justice movements. But aside from that kind of cautionary note, I think that the evolution and growth of this movement and the expansion in terms of who's participating in it has been fantastic. I think one of the greatest challenges, for me at DPA, Drug Policy Alliance, engaging in work that even though, my politics are to the left of center and that most of the people who worked at DPA, their politics were even further left than my own, it was still always important to us to recognize that we needed to build coalitions with people not only in the center, but on the right, and not even just the libertarians. That if we wanted to win legislation, win ballot initiatives to succeed, we needed to speak in a language and with a type of argumentation that could appeal beyond our base. I sometimes worry in drug policy reform, and even more so in other elements of the kind of more progressive social justice movement, that it's become so focused on speaking in its own language, using its own verbiage, making its own types of value, that it's basically alienating potential allies in a way which is going to prove counterproductive and limit the broader success of these movements.
Wow. Yeah, I think, not to take it back to like a whole sort of hippie type of rhetoric here, but I think when you talk about oneness and togetherness and sort of people being able to go beyond identity politics, to utilize identity politics where it's necessary and helpful, especially in a movement like drug policy, but also to not let that necessarily be a thing that divides people who are technically on the same team.
Yeah, I think that a large part of identity politics is basically ultimately going to be 2 steps forward and 3 or 4 backward. That I think we need to be focused much more on values of what it is we believe, as human beings, regardless of our ethnic or racial or gender or sexual identification. I think that's what's important. And so I think one of my regrets about watching kind of the younger elements of the progressive community where identity comes first, it is first and sometimes first, second, and third, and you have to proclaim your identity before you even get to what it is you believe. And people think that an identity is something that you believe in, as opposed to having a broader commitment to a set of values. I think it's damaging to the broader hopes of the progressive movement having greater power in America. I think it's damaging to the Democratic Party. I think it's playing into the hands of the right wing. I think it's playing off, it's in some respects, you have a ugly form of right wing kind of, white nationalism and stuff that emerged, but there are elements in which some of that, I don't want to blame it all on progressive identity politics, but it's definitely feeding off of some of that. So I think identity politics I think historians are going to look back, decades from now at this time in American history. And I think there's a reasonable possibility that many very thoughtful people with very progressive values will say that putting identity politics before other value-driven, causes ultimately was hopefully not a fatal, but a fundamental flaw to what was happening in the early part of the 21st century.
Wow. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, is there anything I didn't ask you that you want to add or talk about? Or...
No. Anyway, listen, my podcast, PSYCHOACTIVE, I just completed 2 seasons of it, and it's on all the channels. So I hope your listeners will tune in to PSYCHOACTIVE and listen. If any people have comments or questions, they can email me at ethan@nadelmann.net. Can't promise to respond, but I'm always read what I do receive. And I'm hoping I'll get the podcast up and going sometime in the future again. But now I'm taking the last episode goes up this week, and I'm going to take a nice little break and think about what else I want to do.
All right. Well, good luck with whatever it is that you decide is next. And thank you so much for coming on to Set and Setting, and hopefully more conversations soon.
Sounds good, Madison. And good luck with your trip to Israel. Okay.
Thank you. All right.
Bye-bye.